point. And I don't know if you can see this, but basically what this is just showing, so these first two fish there, those are your salmon and pelagics, they're allowed in all of those zones. And then crab and squid are only allowed in the conservation area high, medium, and the medium. Halibut's allowed in the medium, and then rockfish and urchin aren't allowed in any of those zones. So we're setting targets for each of those in those zones in which they can occur. And basically what we found was that by doing that, without compromising our conservation goals of that 10% in reserve and then the remaining 20% distributed into any of those zones, that we could achieve impacts or minimize our impacts to fisheries to 9% for all the fisheries in the study region. So what this shows is basically at that point, 91% of those fisheries being targeted into those zones, that after 91% is where you start to see effects in terms of not meeting your conservation targets. So as you increase, and so what we did is for each of those fishery targets, just increase them incrementally by 1 to the point where we got at 92%, and then we start to see where we're not meeting our conservation target of 10% in reserve and 30% overall. And as you get to where it's at 100, then they completely reverse where you're not meeting anything, which is, again, maybe stating the obvious, but I think it's interesting how, if you could set as many targets and as many zones as you want, you can start to develop trade-off curves like this that then compare and contrast at certain thresholds where things are compatible or incompatible. So this is the one spatial slide I guess I have of maps. And so what you're looking at here from left to right is, so the left, the blue one is zone 4, which is a conservation medium zone. So that's the output of where basically this is a selection frequency if you run Marxan or Marxan with zones 100 times, and the darker the color, the more times it was selected. And so it's basically, what's interesting here is it's identifying that dark blue area. And if you were to overlay that map with the halibut grounds, which is it's the one zone in which halibut can be harvested in, it's actually a direct, that is the halibut grounds right there. So it's, at least in theory, is telling us that it's actually working because we're allowing that fishery to occur in that zone, and so that's the first place it goes. The next map there, the dark green, is zone 1, which is the no-take reserve zone, and so nothing is allowed in that zone, and so those are the areas that came up. The next that's the best solution with Marxan with zones, so it may be a little hard to read, but basically each one of those colors then represents each one of those zones, and then the next one up is the best solution out of Marxan. So you can see there's a high degree of correlation between at least spatially between Marxan and zones and Marxan, but all Marxan with zones is telling you is, okay, how do you break out that reserved area into different types of zones? Okay, so just a couple more slides. 2 slides, just kind of key messages. One on key messages from this paper. Again, an optimization tool that allows for multiple zones versus one that only can identify one marine reserve delivers potential solutions that could have a small overall impact to fishing communities. More equitable across individual fishing sectors. And what we mean by that is that last slide there where we included the fisheries targets where it was a 9% impact to all the fisheries across the board. Because that's something that fishing communities and regions want is who's it going to be equitable? Is it going to be equitable, or is one sector of the fleet going to take the brunt of this? At least that's some of the things that we've run up against. And in doing all that, you're still able to achieve your biodiversity goals, because in each one of those scenarios, at least until you get up to 91% or 9% impact, you're still meeting those targets that you've set. I don't know if this is the point of the paper or if it's a point of Marxan, or I guess my personal point is that tools like Marxan with Zone or any tool should kind of help inform the process and shouldn't replace the process if stakeholders are involved. The California initiative put a pretty heavy emphasis on it being a stakeholder-driven process, and that the stakeholders are the ones drawing the maps or drawing the MPAs. And I think a tool like Marxan with Zones can kind of help inform where they're placing or where they're drawing their MPAs, but it shouldn't be something that just completely replaces the stakeholder input and process. these are kind of overarching key messages, both with just kind of Marxan with zones, or I guess with Marxan with zones, is that, I think one of the benefits of Marxan or Marzone is that it's systematic, comprehensive, cost-effective, reproducible, and complementary. Marxan is based in the theory or the talk around systematic conservation planning, and it allows you to address that. I talked about this earlier, but I again just want to reiterate it. You got to define your zones. You got to know what you're zoning for. If you don't know what you're zoning for, or if you at least have options of what you're going to zone for, and then you have Marxan with zones to be able to go through those different scenarios of what those zones might look like. But at some point in those process, that those zones need to be defined. And in part of defining those zones, you have to have a really clear understanding of compatible and incompatible uses of the ocean. That can be everything from like human use conflicts between commercial fisheries and recreational fisheries to the compatibility between that fishery being sited in a place that may have adverse impacts to the habitat there. So really clear in understanding how to define those uses and how they relate to your zones. I guess this one here is more, just a pet peeve of mine, is not to overcomplicate things. And I've seen lots of different, and maybe the process calls for it, and maybe it doesn't, and maybe there's science out there that says this is a good thing or not. But I've seen a lot of exercises where you have a lot of data sets, and you're trying to feed all these data sets into Marxan, and I would really question, do you need 500 data sets, or do you even need 100, or do you need 30? Maybe you do, but I would really go through the process of questioning what your goals and objectives are, and if you really need to go out and find all the data in the world to support it. And then the other thing to really think about when you're doing this, too, is really pay attention. And when we were developing Marxan with zones with the University of Queensland, I spent a lot of my time working with Matt to really think about the calibration and parameter setting. And this was all occurring at the same time PACMARA was hosting the best practices or good practices handbook workshop. And so it was good timing for us, as well as that was happening, to also think about, okay, how do those practices that were developed in that guidebook translate to Marxan with zones? I don't know if there is a plan, or if anyone's talking about developing a guide for that. I think it probably needs to be used a little bit more in order to develop some good practices. Because I think there was a host, maybe 5 or 6 PhD projects at the University of Queensland that were using this. I know that we're using this. I know that there's some folks in BC using Marxan with zones. There's another published paper by Carrie Wilson on the terrestrial side of things. And then Hedley Graham is doing some Marxan with zones work in the Coral Triangle. But other than that, it hasn't been used a ton. So I think there's still a lot of work that kind of needs to be done in exploring different ways in which it can be used both terrestrially and in the marine environment. That's it. We'll point out that if you just go to the Marxan website, if you haven't done it, it's free. Both Marxan and Marxan with zones is free. And you just go to that site and you're able to download it from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. So I just wanted to let everyone know that there's an opportunity for questions now, and I would just ask if you have a question to come and get in line behind the microphone, because it's not wireless, so it'll be difficult to pass it around throughout the crowd. So it's open for questions if there are any.
Hi, I'm Kyle Clifton. I'm the Marine Use Planning Coordinator for the Gitga'at First Nation on the north coast of BC. I have a couple of questions. The first would be, for all of the different industries and users, each stakeholder group, how did you, when you did this analysis, how did you rank? Because I understand in this program you kind of need to